research has told us what works, but too often I think that knowledge doesn't make it into daily practice. And certainly this is true in policing. And so my article focuses on why that gap exists and how implementation science, which is an entire field of research, how implementation science can help to close that gap. And, I think the idea behind it is that, publishing strong evidence, which is what the National Institute of Justice does, publishing that evidence isn't the same as changing behavior. And so diffusion and dissemination help. They help to spread ideas, but without implementation strategies, even proven practices fail to stick. And so even the people who are aware of these practices, have the best intentions, really struggle with that implementation aspect. And so I think in the past, we've mistaken awareness for action, and implementation science helps to correct that. So I think it's really important that police leaders are familiar with implementation science and know what it has to offer. And again, implementation science asks a different question. It doesn't ask, does this work? But instead, it asks, under what conditions will this particular intervention or program work here? And not only that, but will it last? How do we sustain it? And I think in our field today, the stakes are higher than ever to get things right and to do really good work. And poorly implemented strategies not only waste resources, but they can harm trust. They can undermine legitimacy, impact morale at the frontline level, even when the underlying idea is sound. And so, having a blueprint, which is what I try to provide in this article, blueprint for understanding implementation science and some of the principles that underlie this area of research, could be very, very helpful for our practitioners. I will say that implementation science is a relatively young discipline. And if you study the history of how disciplines evolve, you know that young disciplines are messy. Ideas are all over the place. They're really, really hard to grasp and sort of get your arms around and really be able to distill from that evidence base or that body of research things that are very, very useful. But I think in this article, what I tried to do was say, listen, there's really 5 principles. And if you use these 5 principles as a blueprint for your action in the field, you want to adopt an evidence-based practice. If you can really adhere as much as you can to these 5 principles, you're much more likely to experience success in terms of implementing your evidence-based practices. And those 5 principles, they all start with C, because academics love it when, we can come up with some acronym or some way of helping people to remember what it is we're trying to share. But the 5 principles were commitment, concordance, co-production, capacity, and culture. And anybody in the field who's a police leader knows how important each of those are. But commitment really just means, listen, success isn't just about, did this particular intervention reduce crime? There's all sorts of other things that police leaders have to be cognizant of. So it's not just about effectiveness, but efficiency. Did we do it in a way that helped to conserve resources, right? Did we do it in a way that we didn't harm particular populations we didn't mean to harm? All of the other outcomes that we should be concerned with are sort of in that commitment principle, that sort of like, the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. That's the idea of commitment. That's what we're really trying to do there. If it works but it harms trust, is it really worth it in the end? So that's a very critical principle. I also think with concordance, police research fails when goals are misaligned. And I've participated in so many evidence-based research projects, across the country, helping agencies to implement these things. And when goals aren't aligned, everything falls apart. And goals between leaders, police leaders, researchers, and communities. So concordance is about, listen, take the time up front to sit down, be transparent, share your objectives, agree upon your objectives, so that as you move forward, you don't suffer from the scaffolding coming apart underneath you. I think that that's really possible. So when everybody agrees on the implementation or agrees on the why we're implementing this particular intervention or program, then success becomes possible. And, the best research isn't done to police or to communities, it's done with them. So the co-production principle is really all about, making sure that we're being rigorous, and that our findings are actually useful. And that by including others in the design of the research and in the interpretation of the results, this helps to prevent misinterpretation of the data. It helps to prevent what we're trying to do from being divorced from the context in which it's occurring. So co-production is critical, obviously, and even the most motivated police agency, when they lack capacity, they fail. And so, whether it's data systems, training, staffing, having the leadership capacity to pull off some of these interventions, this is so important. And so, what implementation science suggests is listen, pay attention to building your capacity either before you implement some of these practices or while you're helping to implement or while you're working to implement some of these practices. So, if you have an outside researcher working with you, can they help to build your research capacity? Can they do a little bit of training, not just be the independent researcher, but help train internally so that you have a greater capacity to conduct your own research in the future? So, really focusing on capacity is really important. And then finally, I think culture determines, I think we'd all agree, whether or not evidence-based practices will survive leadership changes or some of the shocks into the system or crises that agencies might experience. So without feedback, without accountability, without learning, good ideas disappear. And so culture is really about deciding what actually happens after the memo goes out, right? Where is your accountability structure? How do we ensure that people are accountable for getting things done? So if we can adhere to those five basic principles, or at least include them as a blueprint in our plans as we think about adopting evidence-based practices, I think we will give ourselves a leg up and we're more likely to be successful in the end. I think it includes everybody. It's a great question because I would argue it even extends beyond police leaders and their research partners. I would say communities have to understand the importance of these principles too, because otherwise they might not understand what it is we're doing or why we're approaching a particular project in a particular way. And I don't think that we should say it's just about police leaders either. I think it goes beyond police leaders too, because so often what I find is that when we don't explain these principles to the front line, again, they feel disconnected from what it is that they're doing. They're being asked to do something as part of an evidence-based practice, and they have no idea why they're doing it. And they have no idea why they might be taking an extra step in order to adhere to one of these principles. But if part of our training and what we do on a daily basis is helping our frontline practitioners understand that this is research, this is the power and the value of research, but here's the power and the value of actually implementing evidence-based practices really well. And here are the principles that help us to achieve that. I can't overstate the value of ensuring that our frontline officers understand this as well. I think when you're communicating the importance of anything, a memo doesn't cut it. And we sort of have to practice what we preach too. So if we're saying that, we value the co-production of knowledge, well, that has to be true internally too, not just for this evidence-based practice, but part of everything we do as an agency. So I think it's about more than just saying we adhere to these principles or we believe in these principles. It's the demonstration of that. So one is act effectively communicating that often in person to people, and not in written form. But then secondly, also demonstrating that in other practices throughout the agency, not just in terms of how we implement evidence-based practices, but all of our policies, all of our trainings, everything we do, all of our tactics should really, I think, if we want to enhance their effectiveness, we can use this as a blueprint to do that as well.